and welcome to the Vocal Fries Podcast, the podcast about linguistic discrimination.
I'm Carrie Gillen.
And I'm Megan Figueroa. And here we are. Exciting episode that y'all have been waiting for.
Yeah.
Patiently.
This is a really interesting episode for sure.
It's another book interview, and my favorite. I love it. I love being able to interview people about things they've written.
Yes, yeah, and she has all kinds of interesting things to say about how we conceptualize plants and conservation and...
Yes, and I'm obsessed with plants right now. So, yeah. But what's been going on in the meantime? Yeah, since we last pressed record.
Oh my goodness, I don't even know. So many things have happened. My sister and her family were visiting.
Your little toddlers, right?
Well, my niece is not a toddler, but my nephew is, yeah.
Oh, is your niece in school?
Oh, yeah.
School age?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Anyway,
so I thought I would talk about a podcast that you brought up accents, and I was like, oh, yeah, accents. Let me tell you about this podcast. So this is actually the first season. It has 2 seasons now, but the first season is called Chameleon, Hollywood Con Queen. Have you heard anything about this?
No, not at all.
Okay, so there was this, for a long time, this con going on where this woman and other people would pull in people who were, like, kind of on the fringes of Hollywood. Like, they were maybe about to get their big break, but they didn't have it yet. And this woman would convince them to come to Jakarta and, like, drive all around the city and, like, try to set up this movie that was going to be made that was not real. It was not going to be made. And then that was it. That's, like, she maybe got some money out of them, but not a ton. But she was completely fucking with their lives.
What?
Yeah, it's bizarre. It's a bizarre story. And, okay, I'm going to spoil it a little bit.
Okay.
It's one person doing many different accents. So many accents. American, British, Chinese.
To fool these people?
Yeah. Like, because they're just, like, multiple people. So you got to have I don't know, maybe it's a British producer and an American person helping them, or a Chinese producer and a British person helping them, or whatever. Just multiple accents this one person can do. And they're pretty good. Like,
and this is over the phone.
All over the phone, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm like, this person should be a dialect coach for actors.
Well, this person probably should have just been a Hollywood producer. Like, honestly, they could have done the job. But instead, they were conning everybody. It's a wild ride, and there's even an ASU connection, but you don't find out about it till the very end. It's so wild.
Funny.
Yeah.
So you hear this person doing the voices because of, like, recordings that were captured? Or...
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, so some people cottoned on, and so they started recording this person. Yeah, so you get to hear this person's many different accents. And once you know it's the same person, you can tell, but I don't know if I would have noticed right away, like, that it was the same person. Yeah.
And it's a woman?
Maybe.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Huh.
It's all very spoilery, but it's just, like, it's a fascinating ride. Like, listen, for sure.
I can see how this would make a good podcast. So this is the first season, because the second season's different.
The second season is called Chameleon Wild Boys. And the interesting thing about that is that it's about these 2 boys that just show up, and they claim that they've been living in the forest with their parents for however long. And they show up in this town called Vernon, which is, like, I don't know, half an hour or 40 minutes away from Kelowna, which is where I spent my teenagehood. Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah.
What a coincidence.
It happened after I left the Okanagan. That's the region, what the region's called. So I don't remember the story at all.
Yeah.
There's also an interesting story because, of course, it's like, who are these boys? Who are they really? Are they who they say they are?
Well, if they've only lived with their parents out in the wild, I'm also interested in how they sound, or their language, or, like, what are, like, the idiosyncrasies of it.
I can't remember. I listened to that one first, and it was a while ago now. I don't remember if you get to hear their voices.
Ah.
So anyway, it's really fun. It's a really fun podcast. So.
Yeah, no, I have to listen to that. Oh, that's what I was gonna talk to you about. Freaking Amanda Seyfried and her Elizabeth Holmes voice.
Oh, okay.
So have you been watching I think, what is it called? The Dropout? I don't remember.
No, I think it's The Dropout. Yeah, no, I haven't watched it.
Well, you can tell. Well, they make a big deal about the voice. Everyone's saying she obviously changed it. I think we all knew that already. But I'm seeing Amanda Seyfried do the voice, and you can tell that she's like doing a lot of tensing of like her jaw or the bottom half of her face to get that voice. Like, it looks honestly kind of painful, because I feel like if you keep doing that, it would be exhausting. But yeah, so I just like noticed how it actually, I can see like in Amanda's face how she's doing this, and it doesn't look comfortable.
It doesn't sound comfortable. Like the Elizabeth Holmes voice does not sound comfortable to me. It's always sounded like it should hurt. I'm sure it doesn't, but it's. I think what I'm hearing is the physical exertion she's putting into it. Because to lower your voice that much, it takes effort.
Yeah, no, like it's just like how, I mean, people say like, don't do vocal fry, it'll hurt you. It doesn't. The same thing where it's like, I'm not trying to say that this is like harming her in any way. It just seems like very effortful.
Yes, it
very,
does.
very effortful. That's been the most fascinating part for me, because I'm like, oh my God. Like, I don't know if like Elizabeth got so used to it that, I mean, I don't actually I don't think I've seen her.
I have.
Real Elizabeth Holmes talk a lot.
It doesn't look like she's like the jaw thing. That I don't think that's what she was doing.
She was doing it another way.
Yeah. I mean, maybe she started off that way. That's something that's possible.
Well, that's what I'm thinking. I'm like, okay, she had more experience. And so like...
Yeah, by the time she was on TV talking, she wasn't... She'd been doing it for a long time, like at least 10 years, I think.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm like, okay. I have so many questions. Did she do it all on her own? Did she have any sort of coaching from like someone who knows about changing your voice? I don't know.
I have no idea. But also, I feel like most speech therapists would like counsel her not to do it, because they would be like, oh, it'll hurt you, even though it probably doesn't.
Right.
But I don't know. And I would never have guessed that doing that would have worked so well. I mean, we don't know for sure that really helped, but I'm pretty sure it was part of what was working for her, alongside like the big blue eyes and the blonde hair and everything.
Yeah.
But I think that it did help, and it's just so bizarre to me. Like, it sounded fake to me. It sounded like, and as soon as I hear fakeness, I'm like, oh, I don't trust you.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. No, and the way they portray it in the show, it's like Sunny Balwami, her CFO and partner or daring or whatever, he basically criticizes her for being too adolescent-like, or it's kind of her way to take back or to exert power. I mean, this is what we would have guessed anyway she was doing, right, with lowering your voice.
Yeah, it seemed like that's the way to get men to listen to you, at least men in that milieu, right? Like, I don't know if this would work in a different like area. The fact that it's Silicon Valley and
and venture capitalists,
like that's probably something to do with why it was working. But maybe not. Maybe it would just, if all women lowered our voices, we would get treated differently. Ugh, yeah. I hope that's not true.
Well, I know. Well, especially since we know things like, well, people still think we're talking more than we are, or taking up more space than we are. So I think there's still other things that...
Yes, but wouldn't it be interesting to know if that changed if we all lowered our voices?
Ooh, interesting. I mean, I don't know how we would do this experiment, but like, it's an interesting thought to say, okay, so do people perceive women as taking up as much space as they do when their voice is lowered? Or is it actually more accurate?
You're right. I don't know. I mean, I really don't even know what my hypothesis would be.
I know. I was going to ask you, what do you think?
It might work.
Yeah.
Because really subtle things can have these huge effects. Sometimes they don't have a huge effect.
Right.
Sometimes they do. And yeah, I'm really curious. Really curious. I want someone to do that experiment for me, because I'm not doing it.
Yeah. No. One shout out to myself. I was on KJZZ, which is the NPR affiliate in Phoenix.
Oh, cool.
Talking about how masking is not harming language development.
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's just another way to want to bring it up here, that the whole masking, is it harming children's language development? It's not a thing. I'm getting really frustrated because I think since it's been 2 years now that people are like, okay, now we have kids that were entirely living in a pandemic. And so we're getting more articles like, what did it do to them? This is not an area to be worried about.
Right. Let's be worried about them, maybe not having as much interaction with grandparents as they would have in the past.
Right.
Like, let's be worried about the emotional stuff. Let's not be worried about language development. They just do it. They're just little, like, I don't know. They just do it.
Yeah.
As long as they have input, but they usually have input.
Right. Yes. Thinking about blind children, they learn language, but also for decades, people in Japan have been masking, and it's not like Japanese children don't develop language. So
yeah, but I don't think they were masked in their classrooms.
Again, infants are, useless little things. They're at the whims of their caretakers. So it's like people aren't masking in their homes, like,
yeah,
so it's fear mongering.
It is fear mongering, and it's frustrating because, like, a mask is such a simple thing to do. Like, yes, you should get better masks. They shouldn't be wearing cloth masks anymore. But but you should. It's just such a simple thing to do for yourself and for others around you, and people are mad about it. They don't want to do this simple thing.
No, I know. And so they're like, oh, but children get to school and they can't see their teachers' mouths. I'm like, they have already learned language by then. What is your problem?
I mean, yeah, unless it's a second language, but okay, right. Yes. It does make it a little bit harder, but it's not impossible. Like you're saying, like, blind children can learn a second language later. Like, it's ridiculous.
It's ridiculous. And I think parents are a very easy target because parents want the best for their children.
Well, and they're scared.
Yeah.
This is a scary time. And so it's really easy to manipulate parents who are already extra worried about their children just because, we're biologically kind of that, like, well, no, but just like as a baseline, it's really easy to fearmonger around children. Like, it's always been the case. It's been easy to fearmonger around children. Yeah. So, yeah.
No, I know. Yep. Not cool.
Not cool. Anyways, well, we hope you enjoyed this interview. Yes. I think it's really a fun one.
So today I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Jessica Hernandez, who is Maya Chorti and Zapotec. She is a transnational indigenous scholar, scientist, and community advocate based in the Pacific Northwest. She has an interdisciplinary academic background ranging from marine sciences to forestry. Her work is grounded in her indigenous cultures and ways of knowing. She advocates for climate, energy, and environmental justice through her scientific and community work and strongly believes that indigenous sciences can heal our indigenous lands. Her book, Fresh Banana Leaves, Healing Indigenous Landscapes Through Indigenous Science, well, it's going to be released tomorrow, January 18th, 2022, but our listeners will hear this in a little bit. So it was released mid-January this year. So thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you both for inviting me to your podcast. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. I want to say just a superficial thing. Your book cover is gorgeous.
It is. It's so beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
The colors. Yeah, it's so vibrant.
Like, do you know the artist who did it?
Yes, I cannot recall their name, but yeah, they did a great job. Like, listening to what I wanted the book cover to kind of like describe both of my indigeneities, given that, Zapotec is kind of, is represented through the background, which is like the, Miltla, and the Fresh Banana Leaves, obviously the Maya Chorti community.
So gorgeous. And we got to read the book before others, which is, I think, my favorite part of podcasting. And we wanted to focus in on some bits, specifically what some of the words that we may know in Western science as, like, perhaps being objective, that really aren't. because I think that that's so important for anyone in like Western science to kind of grapple with. So first of all, what does it mean to you to be an Indigenous scientist, and how does that conflict with Western science and its expectations?
Yeah, I think that being an Indigenous scientist just means that I'm upholding my traditional knowledge systems that have been passed down through the generations, obviously not through Western methods, which is, like writing or peer publications or lectures, right? It's mostly like storytelling, songs, prayers, ceremonies. And I think that as an Indigenous scientist, I kind of uphold that. And it's blended with my Western science training that I acquired through my academic career.
And what do you think that Western science, what is it that it's lacking that Indigenous epistemologies can offer?
I think when I view Western science, it often tends to be binary or linear, where, we follow the scientific method, as opposed to Indigenous science or Indigenous knowledge that tends to be holistic, right? As scientists, when we're doing an experiment, we're often removing ourselves from that experiment unless it's like, genetics or something that's human biology. But in Indigenous science, we're always interconnected. We're at the center of what we're doing. Obviously, that's connected to our spirituality, which is, we embody as humans in a natural world. And I think that as a result, Western science tends to be more linear and Indigenous science is more holistic, right? And oftentimes we call that systems thinking, but that's like the best way that it can be parallel to the Western ways of knowing.
So can you tell us a little bit about the relationship between the Zapotec and the land and animals, and also with Maya Chorti and the land and the animals, if they're different?
Yeah, for me personally, they're different just because my father was displaced from his Maya Chorti lands and eventually made his journey through the Zapotec community where my mom is from. And as a result, one of the premises that I write in the book is that our environments, our land carry our trauma. They carry our healing as well. And for my dad, his environments kind of carry the trauma that he faced as a child soldier during the Central American Civil War. And I think that as a result, there is that traumatic relationship that we have with the land in the Maya Chorti community, especially in my family. And with the Zapotec community, we connect that more to, being welcome, being wanted, because, obviously the Central American Civil War displaced a lot of indigenous peoples. It's coined as a genocide by the United Nations, even though there hasn't been any political persecution done to kind of, bring justice to that genocide. So yes, I think it's different. In the Maya Chorti community, we have more of a rainforest. And that's why, banana trees and other plants that have been introduced have been able to thrive there. In the Zapotec community, we tend to have more mountains. That's why we're called the people of the clouds, just because, we're closer to, the high altitudes. And, that's how I will describe their differences.
I've read recently, it's Indigenous scholar Diane Million's felt theory. Again, I wish that these were kind of things that going through Western science education, I was introduced to before, not 3 years after my PhD, but it's the idea that feeling something is legitimate knowledge. And in Western science, that is not the case at all. Is this part of as an Indigenous scholar, as part of your persona, as part of how you approach science?
Yeah, I think that, spirituality is connected to our feelings, to our emotions. And I think that oftentimes, part of us being able to heal our landscapes, we also have to heal ourselves. And, Diane Million kind of covers that because oftentimes in Western science, we are taught to remove ourselves. We tend to, we want to be objective, right? So they tell us to remove ourselves from the work that we're doing. But in current times, even as we advocate for social justice, it's a little bit hard to remove yourself from the work that you're doing, even in STEM, right? Because it's all integrated or interconnected.
What is settler colonialism? And then go into what eco-colonialism is.
Yeah, so settler colonialism is just the byproducts of colonization that we're still facing. Obviously, it introduced capitalism, democracy, and other, areas that continue to oppress indigenous peoples or people of color. And what I coin as eco-colonialism is just like the settler colonial frameworks that have been embodied into our environments, given, that who tends to steward or kind of govern our natural resources is obviously not indigenous peoples. It's people who have power, who tend to be white cisgender men. And with eco-colonialism, it kind of also embodies the drastic changes that our environments have undergone because of settler colonialism, because of the colonization of indigenous lands. And I think that, it's kind of like a multi-layer, area, just given that, colonization kind of introduced multi-layers to our current environments, to our current societies. So, I often say that when we're trying to decolonize, it's kind of like peeling onion layers, right? Because we cannot decolonize one entity by just doing one action. There has to be like multi-layers that will probably take, multiple generations for us to actually decolonize something in that sense.
Could you use milpas as an example of what eco-colonialism has done to the process of growing corn?
Yeah, so milpas tend to be a holistic agricultural system that has been kind of passed down since our ancestors. So it's something that we have been able to maintain. And I think with the eco-colonialism of corn, it kind of sometimes jeopardizes the, multiple species of corn that my communities and other indigenous communities have been able to sustain and kind of prevent from being, genetically modified or given that aspect. And I think that with eco-colonialism, when we talk about genetically modified corn, it kind of allows us it fractures that spirituality or that connection that we have with our, plant relatives that in this case are also a food source, right? So I think that we often hear, our food is our medicine. And I think that when we introduce certain things like that, it kind of fractures that relationship that we have with our plant relatives.
And what is ecological grief?
Yeah, what I coin as ecological grief is just a process that we kind of experience, right? Because we have that interconnection with our spirituality to our plant and animal relatives. And ecological grief will be kind of the mourning or the grief that we experience when we experience ecological loss. For instance, connecting that back to the milpas, climate change is either, resulting in extreme weather patterns. So when there's hot extreme weather conditions, it kind of dries the milpas. They experience droughts. When, we have the opposite effect, heavy rainfall due to hurricane seasons, they're flooded. So I think that as a result of that, our communities experience ecological grief because they're not only facing food insecurity, they're also losing those plant relatives, those animal relatives that, their lives were lost because of extreme weather conditions, as opposed to, building that spiritual ceremony so that we can consume them instead of them being lost just because of climate change impacts.
I've experienced this recently because I'm in Tucson and it is a dry place and there have been more rains. And so we had these much more rains this last season and it was so beautiful, right? It was so green, the flowers were blooming. But what happened was that my prickly pear died because they had too much water they were storing and it just fell over and died. And so that was actually one of the moments that I realized that, I've been getting into plants a lot lately because I think during this COVID isolation, I was like, look at what I have around me. It's so beautiful. But it felt like a loss. Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And how did you cope with that?
It was strange, actually, like getting the prickly pear out of, I call it a cactus garden, but it was these plants that have been here long before I moved in. I actually have lucky enough to have 2 saguaro in my front yard. And so they were near the saguaro, but it's like removing a body from this area of just like these prickly pear that I've loved and I just saw every day. And now they're not there. And it does feel like something is lost. All of this wildflowers were growing and it was just like the greenest I've ever seen Tucson at the same time as these what's natural to the landscape here are dying. Was really hard for me to kind of grapple with, especially during COVID, where we're experiencing all this grief anyway.
Yeah, it just never ends.
Yeah.
How is Indigenous terminology being co-opted to validate settler colonialism in environmental sciences?
Yeah, I think that question can have like multiple answers, right? Because I think that oftentimes one of the examples that I can think of is like even the field of permaculture, where permaculture is an indigenous way of being that came from the Aboriginal people of Australia, but like a white cisgender male scientist in a way, went to study with them or kind of engaged with the community, and then decided to invent the field of permaculture. And now permaculture is something that you can get certified. And it's interesting because I have undergone the certification, and it's interesting to see that not many people know that history. Obviously, it's in, some of the textbooks, but they don't even know the history that it is indigenous, co-opted indigenous knowledge that, it's now generating money. And I think that that's one of the examples. Another way can just be how oftentimes in the environmental science, in the sciences, we view indigenous communities as areas of expertise rather than experts ourselves, right? We can be experts in indigenous science or indigenous communities when in fact, even myself, I have to follow a strict protocol, cultural protocol, to know what I can share, to know what I can write about. And I think that oftentimes we see that co-optation of indigenous knowledge being written in peer review articles that our communities, never agreed to allow them to be published. But yet, because we don't have that access to that higher education where we can have access to those peer review articles, it kind of bypasses the cultural protocol that we as indigenous peoples follow. And obviously that's different with every tribe and community as well.
Like, I'm really excited to talk to you about this word conservation, because I think through reading indigenous scholars, I've come to understand the word conservation as theft. So can you, for our listeners, under what conditions was this conception of conservation conceived? And how does it conflict with indigenous knowledge?
Yeah, I think that when we look at the history of conservation, it started with the, establishment of national parks. And obviously, national parks were these pristine wilderness or these pristine environmental landscapes that, certain white males decided that it was so beautiful that they wanted to, conserve it, to preserve it for people use, for them, to be honest. And as a result of that, there was a lot of indigenous peoples who were violently displaced from these lands. Because oftentimes when we talk about displacement or we hear it in, we read it in articles, it doesn't really entail the violence that was behind displacement. Because, it was brutal displacement. It wasn't like you were given an option. Do you want to leave? Do you want to stay? Obviously people were displaced forcefully. And I think that kind of started that field of conservation when you look at the history. And as a result of that, the word conservation, at least for me, it's rooted in the land theft, in that, identity theft as well, right? Because when we're displaced from our lands, our ancestral lands that have maintained that history since time immemorial, our identities are also fractured. And I think that as a result of that, conservation tends to want to save something. So it's kind of like embedded in that savior complex, as opposed to looking at, kind of protecting the environment through a holistic lens, right? Because oftentimes when we look at conservation, especially when we relate it to animals, people tend to care more about, the conservation of beautiful animals, right? Like the panda bear. I mean, not saying that they're not important, especially cultural important animals to certain cultures, but it kind of ignores the whole holistic environmental landscape that tends to be, important, especially for indigenous peoples, because we don't just have one connection with one animal. We tend to have a connection with the entire landscape, with the entire environment.
And this is connected too with settler colonialism, right? Because this implies that land can be bought and sold or partitioned off, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that, it's that ownership, right? That, we owned Mother Nature. And that's why, it kind of also ties back to patriarchy, right? Because oftentimes patriarchy teaches us that, men, especially cisgender men, have an ownership over like women or femme bodies, because, it kind of relates to that whole notion that, men can own something that's feminine in that sense. And as a result of that, we see that manifest through patriarchy. And obviously that's interconnected to this notion of you can own the land, you can own Mother Nature.
Yeah, so can you explain the connection between ecofeminism and your indigeneity?
Yeah, for me, it's a duality, because my maternal Zapotec community is actually a matriarchal. So it's completely the opposite of a patriarchy where, women are the leaders of our communities. Obviously patriarchy has infiltrated some pueblos because we tend to be a nation. So we're made up of different pueblos. But at least in my mom's pueblo, it's still the chair is still a female. For the whole Zapotec nation, a woman tends to represent us in the National Congress of, Indigenous Communities of Mexico. And with that, it was interesting because, obviously my father's community is totally the opposite, right? Because patriarchy has infiltrated that. And I think that as a result of that, it's a duality for me because I saw how women or even our third gender that we call muches or muses are treated with respect and with honor. And then when you come into the real world that, you leave your community, it's patriarchy, right? Where women are supposed to be submissive, where women are supposed to listen. And obviously, also LGBTQ plus, where, if you're not a cisgender male, you have to be like this submissive role where, you're not dominant. And I think that it has been interesting, at least when I reflect back growing up as a little girl, because I didn't understand those dynamics where, in my community, in my maternal community, all the women and the muses were able to speak first and then the men could speak. But, obviously that's not what we see in current society where, men tend to cut off everyone else. So, yeah.
Getting back to the ecofeminism part, how does that connect?
Yeah, ecofeminism, like we're taught, that, as women or as non-binary folks, like we tend to have a stronger connection with our environments. We have to caretake of, not just our people, but also our environments because it's that whole nature, and nurture situation. And I think with ecofeminism, it's our indigenous women that are, in the front lines kind of advocating for environmental justice, for climate justice. But then because we have patriarchy, this machismo in Mexico, oftentimes the people who get the spotlight are the men, right? And I think that when we look at the examples of the Zapatistas, it was the indigenous woman who kind of led that movement. But, you look at Comandante Marcos, who's a cisgender man who ended up becoming the face of that movement, even though it was like an completely indigenous woman led movement that started with, their elders, their matriarchs.
Well, also another thing you bring up in your book is the femicides. And it's my understanding that most of the people who are killed for being environmentalists are women.
Yeah, and I think that kind of relates back to, what we experience in the United States and Canada, right, with the missing and murder indigenous women. And oftentimes I always tell people that, it transcends borders because we do experience that in, what is called Latin America, south of the border, where, if you're an indigenous woman, because, we go back to this machismo, this patriarchy society, you experience violence and ultimately death. We have a lot of indigenous environmental leaders who are female or who are non-binary who go missing, right? And obviously, their bodies are found years after. But I think that we forget that, right? We forget that when we talk about conservation, it's obviously the people who are truly trying to protect our environments face these kinds of violence and this persecution even today.
Yeah, I think in the United States, I realized while doing some research that Theodore Roosevelt, former president, is thought of as a conservationist. And then I was looking it up, and he had put aside through executive action over 150 million acres of land under reserve or whatever. And so I'm thinking, okay, he's known as a conservationist, but of course there's no mention about how that 150 million acres is theft and that it is being robbed from indigenous communities in the name of conservation. And this is what I really wanted to talk to you about is some of these Western ideals of conservation that we have. How can we use indigenous knowledge, not co-opt it, but use it to have more of this healing that you talk about in the book of the land?
Well, I think that you kind of mentioned something that's very interesting and that's important in order for us to heal. It's like learning our histories, right? Because like when you ask people, who consider themselves a conservationist or who study conservation, if they know the history or, if they are asking these questions that you were asking right now, like, what about these lands? How did he end up, making these, national parks or areas of conservation? And they don't know, right? They don't know that, it was, this violent displacement. And I think that in order for us to heal our landscapes is, we have to start healing ourselves. And obviously that starts with our self-reflection. It depends on our positionality. Like, we all carry power and privilege. Like even for me, despite being an Indigenous woman, like I hold a PhD, I was able to write a book given the opportunity. And I think that it starts with, questioning our positionality and taking action. And I think that that's something that, the younger generation is trying to do, right? Where, we're seeing them being more outspoken for our environments, but yet, we're still missing that important piece, which is, knowing the histories, the Biden histories that many of these, this country was founded on. So obviously, it's a layer that's added on to, the genocide that both, Black and Indigenous peoples face.
Speaking of positionality, can you talk a bit about invasive species and how they are viewed differently by Western science versus Indigenous science?
Yeah, that's something that my elders have always taught me. And as I, immerse myself more into the fields, oftentimes when we are restoring or doing a conservation project, we're, aggressively removing invasive species because, we're seeing them as weeds, we're seeing them as, not wanted. And I think that what we often tend to forget is that for many of us, depending on where we're coming from, depending on our positionality, our ancestral lineage, a lot of those, invasive species that we call weeds are also our displaced relatives. And I think that even it kind of ties back to the title of the book because, banana trees are an invasive species to Central America, to my ancestral lands. But yet, they have become our relatives because, we kind of integrate them in our traditional cooking when we cook tamales, when we cook other traditional foods. So we kind of incorporate those banana leaves. So I think that it kind of relates back to even what Indigenous peoples are facing today with climate displacement and the immigration discourse and how, they're unwanted because, we don't consider them American, which kind of ties back to the whole notion of invasive species are unwanted. But yet, a lot of those species can be, someone's relatives, or if you go back into your indigeneity or your identity and your reflection.
Can you talk a little bit about ecological management?
Yeah, so ecological management, I think it ties back to conservation where, we're trying to manage our environment, we're passing policies and laws. And I think that oftentimes when I think about ecological management and, these policies that continue to govern our natural resources, I can think of like urban parks, right? Because even urban parks or national parks, you're not allowed to, pick any plants. You're not allowed to forage because, it's illegal. It's like city or government property. And I think that, as a result of that, many Indigenous peoples, like we cannot pick up our medicine. We cannot pick up, things that we need for our ceremonies. And I think that ecological management tends to sometimes be, follow the binary way of thinking like that Western science follows. And it tends to ignore that more holistic approach that we should be following in order for us to heal or, in this case, what they call ecologically manage our lands. We have to kind of position ourselves into a more holistic lens so that we're actually healing as opposed to, following this management approach that's very, Western in that sense.
Because when it goes back to Western management, I think I grew up under it, Carrie grew up under it, capitalism. It's going to, the management that is done by Western systems is going to be very market-based. The idea that land is a commodity is something that's so ingrained. Do you view ecological management as kind of moving away from the kind of capitalism of the traditional conservation concept?
Yeah, and I think so because ecological management, like you were mentioning, kind of tends to follow, like asking what gains can we get as opposed to, embodying humans as equal partners with animals and plants. And I think that we do have movements like deep ecology, social ecology that are trying to dismantle those layers, right? But obviously there's a lot of layers.
Can you explain deep ecology and social ecology?
Yeah, so those are theories that are kind of like different than the normalized ecology because oftentimes when we think about ecology, right, we think of this hierarchy of species and humans tend to be on the top. It's like a triangle. But with deep ecology or social ecology, it tends to be linear where we all hold the same power. as species, as animals and plants. And I think that, it's hard for many people to grapple through the idea because, we have been taught that we consume plants, that we consume animals, and not necessarily hold, animals and plants also have a say into what kind of, things that we do with them. And we see that with the agricultural system, right? Where the cattle ranching, where, we're growing all these animals just for them to be slaughtered and without kind of connecting spiritually to those animals that we're going to consume, where we are asking them for permission, where we're, holding a ceremony for their, their sacrifice, for the nourishment that they're going to provide us. It's, it's all market based. And as Megan mentions, capitalism and how much we can get for something like that.
Can you explain the kinship notion, like bananas are our relatives? Because I think for some people it might be confusing because we just don't conceive of it that way.
Yeah, so the kinship notion kind of relates back to many of our creation stories, right? Because oftentimes, in Western religion and Christianity, we think about the creation story of Adam and Eve, and it kind of follows that Christianity, that religion. But for many indigenous peoples, we all have different creation stories where we have stories where the creator created us based on from, our environment. So obviously that's why a lot of native species, our cultural keystone species, are part of our identity. For instance, in the Pacific Northwest, in the state of Washington, salmon tend to be that for many indigenous peoples here because, the creation stories say that, they were created as part of the salmon. They're their relatives. So I think that as many people view Adam and Eve as, their relatives, we view animals and plants as our relatives because we came from them instead of, I think in the Christian story, how God created the man, how God created the woman. In our creation story, the creator kind of gather environmental things that they, and I would say they or she found from our environments to create us as humans and obviously our ancestors. So I think that as a result of that, we have those spiritual kinships or the spiritual connections to certain plant and animals. And in this case, because banana trees are, displaced, they're not native to our lands, we have built those kinships because, they are everywhere. If you go in, Central America, there's banana trees, like not necessarily in plantations, as that's how they were introduced to, commodify the plantations so they can export bananas, especially, Latin South America is one of the, I think it is the largest exporter of bananas, but to kind of, in a way, we built those connections.
An example that people will understand, hopefully that is coming from where I'm at right now in the Sonoran Desert, is that we've completely ignored our relationship with our jaguar relative. And this, I think, is environmental justice and border justice are so connected, is that the border wall that people on the right want to build is destroying these animal habitat, their habitat, call it habitat, the ecology of the land, because the jaguar it can't go into Mexico. It can't come back over. And it was able to do that before humans intervened and, land becomes commodity and all of this and borderlands and stuff.
White humans.
Yes, sorry. But yeah, the jaguar was near extinction at one point, and it's, it just makes me so sad. And the same goes for like the Mexican gray wolf. A lot of animals in this area are being affected by white humans arguing about borders.
And, with the border situation, it's, it's become so political that, we kind of, like you were mentioning, we tend to put our needs first as humans, as opposed to, looking at the animals and in this case, endangered animals that we should be, healing as well and protecting.
This is also, a good reason to talk about all of this is that these are things that are being affected right now. Like this is hurting jaguars right now. This is hurting the other animals along the border right now. And our listeners probably have all heard about the border wall debate and all of that. So this is, it might not seem like it's affecting climate or environment, but it is. If you ask these questions like you were talking about and know things, know histories of things, you'll probably see how a lot of it will affect the land and the animals around you.
And also the plants too, because when the wall was being built on Tohono land, all the saguaros were pulled out and they're protected.
Yeah. Yeah.
It didn't matter. They were just torn down and thrown aside.
Right. And that's a crime. So a normal person, an individual cutting down a saguaro, you get arrested, you get fined, whatever. But then in the name of capitalism or of border, whatever, this is okay. It's just angering.
In the name of nationalism.
Nationalism, yes. Yeah.
So actually, yeah, can we talk about the term environmental justice? How was it conceived? What conditions was it conceived under? And how does it conflict with Indigenous knowledge?
Yeah, I think that environmental justice, obviously, it's a coin that was created in Western academia. Even though, it was created by Black scholars, it's housed in academia. And obviously academia tends to exclude to many people, many identities, especially people of color, non-binary people. It wasn't created for us. And in that sense, environmental justice is, it was a term coined, but I think that obviously it's important to acknowledge that, indigenous communities in Africa, around the world, have been trying to advocate for the protection of their environment, their lands since time immemorial, right? Since colonization started, where, we had the first, settlers come to, indigenous lands and kind of steal them, lead a genocide. And I think that sometimes environmental justice tends to conflict with indigenous communities because sometimes, and I will quote many of my elders, sometimes they say, it's not a choice for us. It's not environmental justice because it's our only way of surviving. It's our only way of maintaining and protecting our identities and communities. So I think that they often view environmental justice as an option, like, oh yes, we can become environmental justice advocates, but for them, it's their only choice. It's like they're forced to do certain things, not because, it's trendy or not because, they think it's something that they should join. It's something that they have to join, that are forced to join as well and lead in that case.
Do you think there's a better term for that would encapsulate all of what you just said?
Yeah, I think it's hard sometimes to come up with terms, right? Because we're thinking in English, but, I will say, protecting, we hear even, land protectors kind of refuse to be called activists or protesters, right? Because they were like, well, we're land protectors. So I think that every community has their way of, what they view, that fits more of their protocol. But I think that will be an example, right? How, in Standing Rock, the indigenous communities decided that they were not protesters or anything else. They were land protectors.
Yeah, that's a really good example.
And it goes back to the idea that we should ask communities for what they want to be called, since, our podcast about language, what they would want from us if we are, trying to help. I mean, instead of co-opting or intervening or white savior complexing, having a conversation and learning from each other instead of just, I don't know, just all of the stuff that we've been doing. Yeah, opening those kind of conversations.
Listening. More of us should just be listening.
Yes, absolutely.
Speaking of that, what can all of us learn from Indigenous sciences that most of us have been ignoring so far?
We all have Indigenous roots at one point, and obviously, some communities have lost that. And I think that with Indigenous science, we can learn that, we can take the steps to heal our environments. That oftentimes, when we look at the climate change discourse, it's kind of like a doom situation, right? But oftentimes, that tends to kind of dismiss people who already don't believe in climate change. And I think with Indigenous science, it goes back to, the examples that we were talking about, how we should build those connections with the animals, right? Like, for instance, a situation that's happening at the border where people don't know that, that wall is not necessarily just a political act, but it's also kind of an environmental, act, and it's impacting many of the endangered species. And I think that with Indigenous sciences, it teaches us to kind of connect ourselves back to our environments, whether it be our ancestral lands or our ancestral environments or the environments where we're displaced, currently, depending on our positionality or identity. I don't know if that answers your question.
It's good. Having some reason to care about asking what can we give to the land instead of taking and just not giving. Well, thank you so much for being here and talking to us about, I think, some concepts that a lot of us will still grapple with or begin to grapple with, which I think is good.
Yeah, do you have any last words for our listeners that you'd like to share?
No, thank you for having me. And like you both mentioned, it starts with listening, because oftentimes, we don't listen to listen. We listen to kind of speak. And I think that, that's something that we should start applying in our lives, especially, as we still undergo this pandemic. So.
Oh, and also buy banana leaves. The book.
Yeah, the book. I was like, it might be hard for me to get them here. I don't know. I've never looked for them here, though.
Yeah.
Anyway, so thank you so much. And we always leave our listeners with one final message. Don't be an asshole. So this month, we would like to thank Catherine Anderson for becoming a patron.
Yay! Thank you, Catherine.
Yeah, thank you. And anyone who would like to support us, you can do so at www.patreon.com/vocalfriespod, where we have stickers and we have mugs and we have bonus episodes.
Yes.
And this month's bonus episode is all about AI and humans working together to write very weird prose.
Yes, best BFFs. Just co-writing a book.
The Vocal Fries podcast is produced by me, Carrie Gillen, for Halftone Audio. Theme music by Nick Granum. You can find us on Tumblr, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Vocal Fries Pod. You can email us at vocalfriespod@gmail.com, and our website is vocalfriespod.com.